Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into what is arguably one of the most intense, rapidly evolving geopolitical earthquakes of our time. For decades, the conflict between Iran, Israel, and the United States, well, it mostly operated in the shadows, right? It was a covert proxy war. Think sabotage, deep intelligence ops, and proxy militias. But as we've just seen, that shadow war has literally exploded into an unprecedented regional conflict in 2026. Our goal today is to trace exactly how this happened. We're going to walk chronologically from its historical origins right up to the present day to map out the motivations, the strategies, and the massive consequences for everyone involved. To put the sheer gravity of this situation into perspective, former head of Israel's Military Intelligence Directorate, Amos Yadlin, really hit the nail on the head. He pointed out that the world faces a stark choice, either a stabilized, thriving Middle East or a fractured region locked in perpetual conflict, and a nuclear arms race. The kind of arms race that makes the Cold War look like a walk in the park. Now, the chaotic events of 2025 and 2026, they didn't just happen overnight. To really grasp how we got to this precipice, we have to rewind the clock a bit and take a journey back in time.
Okay, let's dive into this. Act 1. Allies to ideological enemies.
Now, this pre-1979 history might actually surprise a lot of you. Back then, Iran and Israel actually shared a pretty robust peripheral alliance. They were united against Soviet-aligned powers and pan-Arab nationalism. They even collaborated on a joint missile initiative called Project Flower. El Al had routine flights between Tel Aviv and Tehran, and Iran was literally supplying oil to Israel through the Eilat-Ashkelon pipeline. But that entire dynamic collapsed with the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Under Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran adopted a strictly anti-Zionist, anti-Western state doctrine. To give you a sense of how dramatic this was, the Israeli embassy in Tehran was literally handed over to the Palestine Liberation Organization. This wasn't just tough talk, it was a total strategic 180 that set the stage for decades of bad blood.
But to really understand the whole picture, we absolutely have to look at Tehran's perspective on its own security. A critical piece of this puzzle is the 1981 Algiers Accords. Basically, this was an agreement where the U.S. formally pledged not to intervene politically or militarily in Iranian internal affairs. Fast forward to today, and Tehran used its entire regional posture, building up proxy networks and missiles, as a strictly defensive, legally grounded necessity. From their viewpoint, successive American administrations have systematically violated the Algiers Accords. They feel completely encircled, which, in their eyes, forced them to build up these heavy deterrence capabilities.
So that brings us to Act 2, the nuclear shadow war.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it perfectly maps out this incredibly complex regional deterrence equation. Following the '79 revolution, direct confrontation was mostly avoided, so the conflict moved entirely into the shadows. On one side, Israel relied on its core assets: unmatched military superiority, elite air defenses, rock-solid U.S. backing, and the Begin Doctrine. On the flip side, Iran operated with a completely different playbook. They leaned heavily on an axis of resistance, made up of proxy militias across the region, maintained a massive ballistic missile arsenal, and steadily pushed their nuclear program toward weapons-grade levels. It's a textbook asymmetrical standoff.
Let's zoom in on that Israeli strategy for a second, specifically the Begin Doctrine. This is absolutely foundational for Israel. The doctrine basically states that no regime threatening Israel's existence will ever be allowed to acquire nuclear weapons. Period. This one policy is really what drove Israel's strategy of extended coercion over the last couple of decades. They used intensive intelligence manipulation, targeted sabotage, and heavy diplomatic pressure to basically force a confrontation over Iran's nuclear ambitions, all while making sure the United States stayed heavily involved in neutralizing the threat.
And you can see exactly how this doctrine altered global diplomacy back in 2018. That's when Mossad executed Operation Stealing the Reality. It sounds like something straight out of a spy movie, right? Israeli operatives essentially infiltrated a warehouse in Tehran and smuggled out half a ton of physical and digital records detailing Iran's historical nuclear weapons work. The intelligence from this massive raid was immediately shared with the U.S., and it directly influenced the Trump administration's decision to pull out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and kick off a maximum pressure campaign. In one fell swoop, the diplomatic status quo was totally dismantled.
Which sets the stage for Act 3. The 2025 turning point.
For years, this shadow war just kind of simmered. But in the summer of 2025, it completely boiled over. Now, in early 2025, there actually was a genuine attempt at diplomacy, with U.S.-Iran negotiations happening in Muscat. But the distrust was just way too deep. On June 12th,
the IAEA officially declared Iran in breach of its non-proliferation obligations. Literally the very next day, June 13th, Israel lost patience and launched Operation Rising Lion. And then just 9 days after that, the US jumped in with its own massive strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. In less than 2 weeks, we went from diplomatic talks at a table to open airstrikes.
So the crucial point is the sheer, staggering scale of Israel's preemptive strike here. Operation Rising Lion saw over 200 Israeli aircraft swarm Iranian airspace. They hammered roughly 100 targets spread across 15 different locations. The operational damage was devastating. They wiped out an estimated 50% of Iran's entire missile stockpile. And the human toll was massive, too, killing 30 senior Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders and 11 key nuclear scientists. Basically, Israel saw a rapidly closing window and used it to preemptively gut Iranian capabilities before they could cross the nuclear threshold.
And the escalation certainly didn't stop there. On June 22nd, the U.S. directly entered the fray. They dropped 14 massive ordnance penetrators from B-2 stealth bombers right onto heavily fortified Iranian facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. We're talking massive bunker-busting munitions that inflicted incredibly severe damage, setting the Iranian nuclear program back by years. At this point, the covert shadow war was officially dead. A hot war had begun.
Let's move to and see how this builds into Act 4, Total War and Global Fallout.
While the summer of 2025 was all about targeted strikes, by early 2026, it had morphed into a total regional war. The US and Israel laid out 4 main objectives for this massive offensive: halt the nuclear program entirely, roll back ballistic missile capabilities, neutralize Iranian-backed proxy networks across the Middle East, and ultimately facilitate the collapse or overthrow of the Iranian regime itself. Now, it's important to note that critics globally strongly condemn this. Many view the regime change efforts and resource capture not as defense, but as illegal wars of aggression that completely violated international law.
On February 28, 2026, the rhetoric turned into devastating action. Get this, a staggering 2,000 joint U.S. and Israeli strikes rained down across Iran in a single offensive, 2,000. This was part of the largest U.S. military buildup in the Middle East since the invasion of Iraq back in 2003. They systematically hit military sites, nuclear infrastructure, and directly targeted the top leadership.
The impact of this was historic, to say the least. The U.S.-Israeli offensive resulted in the assassination of Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with the defense minister and senior IRGC ground force commanders. Now, facing what they viewed as an absolute existential threat, Iran didn't just collapse. Instead, they retaliated aggressively. They launched massive waves of missile and drone strikes targeting Israel, U.S. military bases scattered throughout the region, and even neighboring Arab states. The conflict had officially engulfed the entire Middle East. So why does this matter to you, wherever you happen to be watching or listening right now? Because the economic and global fallout was practically instantaneous. Iran immediately closed the Strait of Hormuz, literally one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet. This triggered an overnight massive spike in global oil and gas prices, creating severe fuel crises as far away as Ireland and the Philippines. Beyond just the economic shockwaves, the world saw widespread protests, deep diplomatic polarization, and basically a complete fracturing of international relations. What started as a regional conflict became an acute global crisis in a matter of days.
We've traced this incredible journey from the strategic alliances of the 1970s right through decades of shadowy intelligence wars, all the way to the devastating full-scale bombardments of 2026. Today, the geopolitical landscape is entirely fractured. So, I want to leave you with this final, provocative question to think about. Will this unprecedented escalation force a permanent, albeit incredibly painful, reshaping of the Middle East that paves the way for eventual stability? Or have we crossed a threshold that will trap the world in a devastating, unending cycle of perpetual retaliation? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and remember to keep asking the hard questions.